Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, What's New in Dynamics GP 2015? We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us. There are a couple of housekeeping items we'd like to mention before we begin. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand so that we can unmute your line or submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. We'll be answering questions throughout the presentation, and we'll also be following up after to answer anything additional. So at this point, Jeff, I believe we're ready to transition the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone on the line. We certainly are glad that you're willing to take an hour out of your day to learn more about GP 2015. Just as a point of reference, we did this session once before this year, we know more and more of our clients are getting prepared to make the transition and upgrade, and thought it would be good to kind of circle back and go through this process again. We are going to show a couple additional pieces today that we weren't able to last time due to a new release, and hope that you enjoy and are able to see the benefit of upgrading to Dynamics GP 2015. So our agenda looks like this. We're going to talk about the Dynamics GP roadmap. We'll go through that, and then we'll talk about what's new in Dynamics GP 2015 as follows. We'll talk about some key benefits, some new system-wide features. We'll focus in on financials, HR and payroll, employee self-service, and then we'll talk about companion apps. With no further ado, I will go ahead and jump in. So I wanted to start off by just giving you a view of the progress that Microsoft has made with the Dynamics GP product. Many of you have been on the product for quite some time, and as you may know, the Microsoft GP team has kind of ramped up the pace over the last couple years in regards to releases. This really started with GP 2013. So in 2012, GP 2013 was released right in December of that year. And so some of the early functionality that was added to GP 2013 included the web client. Some of you may be already using that as well. There was some new functionality, and there were certainly some hosting opportunities. Business Analyzer was now available on Windows. And then one of the big releases was GP 2013 R2, which came out in the first half of 2014. So one of the things I want you to pay attention to, not necessarily focused on a lot today, but into the future, is GP working with Office 365 and leveraging the power of Office 365 and a tool called Power BI to really leverage and increase productivity and provide yourself more information to your important business data. One of the things that's consistent in these releases is that whether it's a major release or a service pack, or now they're calling them R1, R2, R3, is there will be functionality in each one of these solutions. So each time there will be some new functionality. So it's not going to happen like it was with the GP product every 2 years or something like that. GP 2015 was released in 2014, in December of 2014. And a couple key features there that we'll talk about some is service-based architecture. There was identity management. Also, with 2013 R2, there was the advent of workflow, and then really in 2015, the addition of a significant number of additional workflow functions. And I think this is really important for you to take a look at to see if it fits into your organization, because it automates the process of approvals. And so with the release of 2013 R2, there was requisitions were added, also project time and purchase order approvals, and then in 2015 there were a number of additional workflow options that you'll learn about as we go through this process. So workflow continues to be an area of focus with Microsoft, and so you'll notice over time that we will be adding additional workflow functionality. Also, earlier this summer, GP 2015 R2 was released, and a couple things I'm going to show you there are the all-in-one document viewer, AP invoice approval, and also there's a time management app that I'll give you a quick look at. And so there really is going to be some areas where you may be able to take advantage of these functions without actually having to go out to an ISV or third-party product like you may have in the past. And you'll also notice here that GP 2015 Release 3 is due in the first half of 2016. And one of the things that I think is going to be a really important feature there is enhancements to the web client. For those of you that have a technical spin to your profession, there's a movement from a tool called Silverlight, which Microsoft is sunsetting and moving to HTML5 as the foundation for the web client, which will make the web client more compatible and forward-moving, and really it's going to make a big difference in regards to I guess, the ability for it to deliver the way you need it to. Also, it's going to allow us to have multiple browser and device support for the web client, which is really a big part of this movement to HTML5. There will continue to be updates to workflow. I've seen reference to what's called workflow 3.0, and so that will continue to evolve, and it'll be very interesting. One of the things that I think is important is you'll notice as we look at this roadmap, top features requested by customers. I think it's important for you as a user of Dynamics GP to reach out to Microsoft and let them know what you'd like to see next, because they do constantly review suggestions that are made by the user base, and that's how they prioritize what's going to be added in each next release. So again, I think it's important for you to understand that Dynamics GP is a thriving product. It continues to grow in the Microsoft family, and it certainly is evolving, and you can help define the direction for which it goes. All right, so with 2015, there really were three what I would consider major focuses. One is expanded workflows, and we talked about that a little bit in moving from just requisitions. There's now streamlined workflows around financial, purchasing, sales, payroll, and project-related approvals. Single sign-on. So there is an integration with the web client with Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So that allows you to have single sign-on into Dynamics GP. Also, then your login works across GP and Office 365 and other cloud-based applications that you may be using in your organization. So keep that in mind, and again, I'll just place some emphasis on the idea of Office 365. Service-based architecture. One of the things that service-based architecture provides is the ability for developers to be able to create and modify solutions that are made for Dynamics GP. Many of you may be working with custom developed applications today, and this is really a way for which the platform is going to be even easier for opportunities for development. So let's start off with some system-wide features. So I'm going to start off with service-based architecture, and if you're like me, you may not be a technician. You may be an accountant or an application user. So my explanation of this new functionality is really a tool and a platform for which Dynamics GP can continue to scale and continue to meet your needs. It makes it easier for Dynamics GP to expose services and interact with other applications. It is really a platform for which more mobile-based applications will integrate with Dynamics GP, and that includes a tool that I'll show you today that is a kind of a time management application. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. So identity management, and again, I think I mentioned earlier that this really relates to the web client. Identity management allows you to log into Dynamics GP web client using an organizational account. And so what this means is that it leverages Microsoft Active Directory. Again, another situation where the fact that Dynamics GP is a part of the Microsoft family, and it allows it to leverage the stack, and it allows you to have a single logon rather than logging into each of your applications. So you can see that this is the user setup window will have changed, and you'll see that an organizational account is established here, and this allows you then to have that single sign-in. This one happens to be using the Microsoft Azure platform, and so you can see the onmicrosoft.com on this screen, which is really Microsoft's cloud environment. So the next area I wanted to talk was really in workflow. And so from a workflow perspective, there really are a number of areas that have been updated with GP 2015 and GP 2015 R2. So with the advent of 2015, from a financial side, GP added GL batch approvals, and so this then allows you to have users enter transactions into a batch, and then that batch can be sent out for approval before it can be posted. On the purchasing side, with the advent of GP 2015, payables batch approvals are now available. We've also seen the advent of vendor approvals. So if you do any kind of vendor onboarding, and this might be a situation where your purchasing department will find sources for products, and they can actually send this vendor information out to the accounting team for approval, and then things can be checked in that regard, and then they can be added into your Dynamics GP. Also, with the release of GP 2015 R2, there was payables invoice approval, and so this is a big deal in that it allows you to actually send an invoice through accounts payable and have it approved, and in many ways, and there's also document attachment functionality that has been improved over the last couple revisions, and so this in a way could actually be a replacement for in a light way for a document management solution. Those attachments can also go through the workflow as necessary. From a sales perspective, we have receivables batch approval. And I'm actually, when we get done with this part of the PowerPoint, I'm actually going to jump out and show you some of this as well. Also on the payroll side and HR side, there's employee skills approval, direct deposit, employee profile, W-4 approval, and so these now are available for employees to actually update some of their key information if you're using Dynamics GP HR, and then that information will be forwarded on to the HR department for approval. And then lastly, with project accounting, if any of you are using project accounting, there's now expense report approval that has been added to the solution as well. So in GP 2013 R2, the time approval for project was added, and now with 2015, the expense reporting functionality is added as well. Okay, so I'm going to jump out and go into Dynamics GP and spend a few moments with you on workflow. So I'm going to start off within Dynamics GP and going to the Administrative tab. And then within the Administration area, there is an area that is called Setup. And so in this setup environment, under Company, you're going to find an area for Workflow. Inside of Workflow, we have a Workflow Maintenance setup. And you'll notice that in this area, we have the ability to set up workflows in many of the different module groups. So if I select Financial as an example, you may remember that I talked about General Ledger Batch Approval. And so here you can see that under General Ledger Batch Approval, I can create a workflow. So in this first window, what I do is I actually will define the name of the workflow. I will define some of the basic settings for that. So for instance, do I allow approvers to delegate their tasks? Can an originator be an approver? And so just so you know, in my environment, I just so I can show you how this works, I actually am set up as a requester and an approver. So in my setup, you may choose not to have that as an opportunity. Okay? So within the, then once you set up the base workflow, then you'll go into the individual steps within the workflow. I have a very simple workflow step set up here so that I am going to set this up as an approval process. You can set it up so that this is one step of many in the workflow. So you can see that I've designated this as this is the first step. But you can also create steps that will follow each step so that you create a sequence of activities that have to occur for this approval to finish out. Okay, so from a general ledger perspective, this is kind of how we'll set it up. I'm going to actually show you the invoice approval functionality, so I won't go necessarily all the way through on the financial side. On the sales side, at this point, we just have receivables batch approval, so this is similar to what you saw in regards to the general ledger. But one of the things I didn't mention before is I can create actions, and those actions can be based on certain criteria. So we'll talk about that. And then I can define who this particular step of the workflow is assigned to. There are also things that we can do in regards to setting up a time or calendars so that it looks at our work calendar and makes just some smart decisions in regards to distribution of these approval requests. And then when you can set particular messages. So to give you an example, this might be a receivables batch request, and it can go out through the individual email that you use. I'm going to go ahead and close that. But what I wanted to show you here is that this is a template. This template would be, we have two options, I guess I should say, that these workflows can be actually sent out through email, or they can be tasks that are created, workflow tasks that are created within Dynamics GP. If I send out an email, you can see that this will be the body of the particular email that goes out, and so you can set all of this up so it drops the appropriate information in. And there are a variety of these different workflow messages that are already out of the box. You have the ability to update those. Okay. So, from a purchasing perspective, this is where a lot of the work is. So you can see under purchasing, I have the payables batch approval, I have payables transaction approval, purchase order approval. A very popular one, and the first one that was released, is requisition approval, and then we also have a vendor approval. Okay, so under the payables transaction approval, I have a step called invoice approval, and within that, I can have the workflow set up. One of the things that you may notice is there is an activation button here, and so this activate allows you to determine whether you can set this thing up and then activate it, and that puts it into production. Okay, so within a step, I can say for this invoice to be approved, there are certain criteria that has to be met. So maybe what we say is that the invoice amount is greater than $1,000. Otherwise, a workflow is not required. or $10,000, and I can add that as a function. And I can have multiple criteria as well. So I guess I just want you to feel comfortable that you can set this up so that it works within your process. And what we've seen is people are starting to replace manual requisitions, paper requisitions, or sending an invoice out and a stamp on it so people have to sign off and send it back to accounting. Those kind of things are actually part of the value that this kind of workflow actually brings to the table. Purchase order approval, requisition approval, and then vendor approval. So under the vendor approval, this is a simple one as well. I can set up things like USA vendors versus non-USA vendors and certain rules based upon that. Or I can make it more simple and just say Jeff has to approve every vendor that is added before it can actually be active inside of GP. And you can see that this one's active. So I'm just going to do this simple one. I know I was talking about invoice approval, but maybe to show you just a simple workflow so we can move on to the additional features, is that with a vendor approval, you can see that this is active. I've set my settings. I have assigned myself, and this is not a realistic situation, but I've assigned myself the approval process. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to close it. And one of the things you'll notice is that when you go into payables and you go into the vendor maintenance, that when you go to set up a vendor, and I'll just set up one, let's do A Smith 0001, and we'll set up my son Adam Smith. Oops. I'm cap lock impaired, sorry. Adam Smith. And so what I can do here is I can request that this vendor be set up, and I can put in whatever information is important. But you'll notice that your screens have changed, and now you have a submit button. So I can click submit. Oops, I got to have an address. I forgot about that. So we'll call this main. Let's see if it'll let us go now. There we go. And the system then will prompt us for some comments if we have any, and we'll click submit. But in those comments areas, you might put something such as that we're using this vendor to purchase these goods and we need them by next Thursday. And that way the approver knows the necessity for getting this through the process. So now if I select A Smith 01, I just wanted to show you there's new vendor approval pending approval. Now again, this isn't the typical situation because I have I am actually requesting and approving. So this is just more for example's sake. Notice under the workflow, I can view the history of this workflow, and this is going to be an important part of this as well. So I can say that workflow was originated by Jeff Smith. It was submitted at this time, and new vendor approval is pending at this point, and it's assigned to me. All right. So as user Jeff Smith, I'm going to have a navigation list here that will allow me to go in here and approve those particular vendors. So if we go to vendors, you'll notice up here I have vendors not submitted and I have vendors pending approval. So this brings up a navigation list, and there may be multiple requests to add new vendors, and they will actually all show up within my navigation list. And please be patient with me as we bring this up. My virtual environment sometimes is a little slow. So now you can see that Adam Smith is pending user approval. And so as an approver, I have the ability to mark Adam Smith. I can reject it, I can delegate it to another approver, or I can just simply select approve. And if I approve it, then I can put comments that will then go back to the individual requester. And I can click approve. Okay, and you can see that that succeeded. If I go back into purchasing, and I go back to my vendors, and I do a lookup, I should be able to find Adam Smith, and you can see that the vendor onboarding was completed at that time. So this is kind of the workflow. It's a very simple example where I'm requesting and approving, but you can see how this could work. I will tell you that this workflow functionality is actually based on Active Directory. So if there's hierarchical approvals that are required, for instance, for requisitions, it has to go to a manager. There has to be some definition of hierarchy there. If everything goes to the same approver, it's a simpler process and you can just assign that individual user. But certainly, I think it's worth investigating. If you have more questions, certainly let us know. Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint for a moment here. All right. So as we get back in, I'm just going to talk about some more system-wide processes and functions that have been added. One of the things that has been added, it's more of a convenience, and it really applies to companies that maybe have multiple people that do the same type of work within Dynamics GP. This is the ability to copy both the home page and the area page from user to user. So we can see here that in our user setup, we've been assigned a role, and we have the ability to copy settings. And so what we can do is we can copy from a user to another user, and then we also say, are we copying their home page role, their home page content, or their area pages? So any modifications or content that they have on those areas can be copied from one user to the next. So this also comes in handy in situations where you have added new staff and want to be able to provide that individual with the same kind of settings as their predecessor. This is another one that is pretty nice as well. For any of you, which is probably most of you, within your organization, you may use Management Reporter. Management Reporter is a separate application outside of Dynamics GP, but now with the release of GP 2015, we actually have the ability to launch the individual Management Reporter reports directly from Dynamics GP. So you can see here is a list of my Management Reporter reports. I have the ability to then produce those reports directly. Now it launches a Management Reporter and produces those reports for you, but you don't have to exit out of GP, go into Management Reporter to launch those individual reports. So it's really just meant to be a big time saver. Cheryl, are there any questions that have come by so far?
There was one question, or a couple of questions, about the deck being available afterwards, and we will send the PowerPoint deck after the presentation today, so everyone has a copy of that.
Good question. And we won't give you a quiz right afterwards, there's a lot of content here, so we want to make sure that you have plenty of resources to make sure you take advantage. What's the second question?
Can workflow approvals be done through email?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. So I actually showed that workflow functionality through Dynamics GP, but you actually do have the ability to configure the system so that it will actually send an email, and the approval process can be done within your email. So that I wasn't configured to do so, but yes, the answer to that is yes. And so I think, in fact, I think that's a very practical thing, because a lot of times the people that are the approvers may not be GP users at all. And so we want to make sure. That does bring up another point is, for instance, if you're using things like requisitions, or if you're doing vendor approvals, or PO approvals, those types of things, there may be a variety of people that actually are going to be needing to do that kind of work without actually being GP users. And so I just want to make sure you don't get concerned about that skyrocketing cost for GP licenses, because there are actually now what are called self-service licenses that are available, and I believe that they are $60 per self-service license. They're named users, but those users can actually just do certain self-service type applications, such as requisitions, entering time, those types of things, so that they're not putting a financial burden on you just so they can do those minimal tasks. So just keep that in mind as you evaluate whether these tools make sense. And I also want to say that all of these functions, all these workflow functions, are all part of your GP licenses. So these are not, none of these are considered extra modules. So for instance, if you're doing requisitions, it's included in the starter pack. So it's not an additional purchase. Any other questions, Cheryl?
Nope, not at this time.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. All right, so we'll move on into financials. And so what I'm going to do here is just show you a couple other things that have been added. If any of you are using GP and have intercompany needs, then one of the big things that people have been asking about is, if I void a transaction that was an intercompany transaction, I actually have to do the work on both sides, and I also have to inquire on both sides. And now what they've done is they've added new functionality so that you can do an intercompany journal entry inquiry. So if a journal entry has been designated as intercompany, you can actually void it, and it will void it on both sides, both companies, I should say, and you have the ability to inquire into that. So that can be quite useful and a little less of a headache as to the management of multiple companies. Payment terms have been updated. So if you have vendors that provide you with any kind of incentive or discount dates or due date terms, they have added some new functionality. There's now a due date option using a transaction date. You can add days to the due date. You can add additional due options. You can have additional discount options. And some of those options might be due next month, due in X months, certain month, day, and annual terms. And so keep that in mind if you're running into any kind of shortcomings in regards to payment terms today. And those payment terms obviously apply to both the receivables and the payable side of your solution. Also on the financial side, fixed assets year-end close report. It's now printed as part of the year-end close, and it prints for all books and assets impacted, and it includes end-of-year information for an asset. So this is a minor tweak, but I think it's worth noting that it's now included as part of the year-end process. All right, so moving on to the distribution side. Couple things that are happening here is you now have the ability to edit email for historical sales documents. So for instance, you may have emailed an invoice to John Doe, the original invoice, but now you call and you're trying to get paid and they say they haven't gotten the invoice, and you may need to send it to someone in accounts payable. So these are the kind of things that you can do with this new functionality. You can also do the same thing for editing historical purchase orders. So when you're working with your vendor, you can do it for statements. Also, you can do it for payables, remittances, and both historical and current. Now this one, this next feature is something that many of you may face, that issue purchase orders for materials and things like that, but also have a number of transactions that flow directly through payables. So for those of you not using purchase order, you may not know that the purchase order module has a three-way matching functionality. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to issue a PO, receive the goods against that PO, and then match an invoice to the receipt, and then part of the closing of line items and purchase orders relates to all of that being reconciled. But you also may get invoices that you enter directly into accounts payable and skip the purchase order process. And sometimes we've had people that will actually start to enter an invoice in accounts payable, but it really needed to apply to a purchase order. It needed to be matched against the purchase order. So now what this does is it actually gives you a warning to say, hey, you have purchase orders out there for this vendor. Do you want to continue to enter this in accounts payable, or do you want to go enter it through your purchase order matching process? So it's just a way of eliminating a headache. If any of you are using the invoicing module, many of you use sales order processing, but if you're using the invoicing module, it's been added to the web client. All right, so that's the distribution side. I'm now going to jump into HR and payroll. So there's a few things that have been added on the HR payroll side. So first of all, I think I mentioned earlier that in Dynamics GP 2013 R2, we added the ability to enter project timesheets. And those timesheets then could be matched up against those projects, and those labor charges and labor costs can be assigned to that project. So with the release of GP 2013, we've also added the expense side of that. So, you know, in typical project implementations, we have labor costs that get assigned to a project, but we also have materials and expenses that get assigned to that project as well. And so now the project expense report and timesheet replace all the functionality of both the business portal, time and expense, and the PDK, if you're familiar with that. So any of you using project accounting, I think your life should be a little easier. And that does bring me back to the idea that much of this workflow is replacing workflow that belonged in what was called the business portal outside of Dynamics GP, leveraging SharePoint and integrated to GP. And so it didn't work for all of our clients, or many of our clients, and so this is a more self-contained workflow functionality. All of these are. Employee profile. So an employee can update their profile in Dynamics GP using a self-service license, and this could be things like their address, their emergency contacts, their dependents, and all of that information can then be passed over to the HR module for approval. So any of you in HR, don't fret. This information is not going to automatically update your records with no monitoring. It does indeed include functionality to make sure that that is checked and approved before it actually updates your records. Also, if you're a manager, you actually have the ability to view and edit your team members' data. And that can be address, dependents, emergency contacts, position history. All of those can be updated as a manager. Also then there's employee skills and training. HR has always had this functionality, but now you can do it through self-service. You can enter this information, or an employee can enter this information about any training or skill set opportunities that they've taken advantage of, and then it can be routed through the Active Directory hierarchy right into HR. And then the manager also has the ability to review this as well, so they can view all of their employees' education and tests. They can view the employee's skills and training history. And all of this information from a manager perspective is on their navigation list when you're in HR and payroll. And then lastly here, I shouldn't say lastly, but pay stubs are available for viewing and printing in Dynamics GP. So any of you that are using the payroll module, employees can log in using a self-service license and actually view or reprint their pay stub. So that information will be available to them. Their W-4 can be updated, so if they want to make some changes, they can certainly do that. Their direct deposit can be updated as well. And also they can view their benefits. This is not a benefit self-service. It's not open enrollment. It's more of a viewing of their benefits. Okay. Cheryl, are there any questions that have come through on that section?
Let's see, I'm taking a look. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. All right, so the next area that I wanted to talk about is what's called companion app features. One of the things that we talked about earlier was this whole service-based architecture. And service-based architecture is going to lend GP more openly to the ability to add apps that can be viewed and used with Dynamics GP. One of those that I wanted to talk about is called the Business Portal. And so this actually, and not only is it going to, is it an app, but it's a cross-platform app. So the Business Analyzer could be, is going to provide you with content, KPIs, business analytics, and it's going to provide that to you on an iPad, on an Android, on a Microsoft device, any of those tablets. It also is available on your, you can have it on your desktop, but the Business Analyzer is also available on your desktop inside of Dynamics GP. And for those of you that aren't aware, the Business Analyzer actually comes as part of your Dynamics GP. So from my perspective, if you have the ability to take advantage of some functionality to provide you better information about your business operations, it's certainly worth pursuing or looking at anyway. And so I want to make sure that you're aware that this happens. So one of the things I'd like to do is I would like to just spend a minute and show you a couple of these self-service apps, because there's another one that just was added that I want to make sure that you get to take a look at. So first of all, actually I'm going to go back where I was, and I'm going to minimize my PowerPoint. I'm going to jump into GP, and I'm going to go back to my home page. So in Dynamics GP, I can embed the Business Analyzer, and I can have different analytics about my organization. And so I have a variety of these types of dashboards that are available. And so, for instance, here's total sales year to date. I can actually view that data, and it's actually going to be surfaced in a SQL Reporting Services report. And then from there, I have the ability to drill in, and I can see the information, and depending on how we've surfaced it. Okay, so then if I go, and so I'm going to go ahead and close that one, but I go in and I look at my AR aging as an example, and I drill into that one. I'll give you an example of some of the things that we can do. So this will show you the aging. The first graph showed you the total of your AR aging. This graph then breaks it down by aging bucket, and then I have the ability to drill into the 181-day bucket, and I can actually then see all of these invoices that are going to be popping up here in just a second. Now, I'm not configured to do so, but ultimately I can actually drill into these invoices inside of Dynamics GP as part of this solution. So there are approximately 250 or more SQL reporting services reports, many of them being graphic in form, that you could use as dashboards, and they can be displayed right on your GP homepage. And depending on your role, you may have different ones. So the reason I mention all of that is because we also have the ability, if I have a tablet and I happen to use a Microsoft Surface, that I can have the same kind of information, and I can have it out on a self-contained application. I can have this on an iPad, I can have it on an Android, I also can have it on a Windows type tablet. So this information, if I'm a traveling executive and I want to keep track of certain information, I'm going to have the ability to do that. Okay, and then the other app that I wanted to make sure that you knew about was and this is actually, I'm also running this on my Surface, is a Dynamics time management solution. And so this actually is a way that we can actually, we can enter time cards, we can request sick time, vacation time, and so if you're using the HR module in Dynamics GP, then there's workflow that follow this so that you can actually have a calendar of activities. So these are two examples, and again, I'm going to tie back to the idea that this whole service-based architecture is really what provides us the means for which we can do this type of work. I'm going to close that and go back to my Dynamics GP and my PowerPoint. All right, so that's about, we've taken about 50 minutes and we've talked about a lot of the new things that have been added to Dynamics GP. We've talked about workflow, we've talked about enhanced business intelligence and app functionality. We've talked about financials and distribution updates. And again, back to the idea that this type of update is going to come fast and furious. So like I said, Dynamics GP 2015 was released in December. In June, R2 of 2015 was released, and we should see something after the beginning of the year, which would be an R3, and I've even heard rumblings of a GP 2016. I think it's important for you to communicate with your partner and make sure you stay up to date with Socius in regards to when is the right time and what is the strategic best way for your organization to be able to take advantage of nice functionality without having to upgrade all the time. That's not our expectation, but just make sure you're aware of what's coming and how it can help your organization. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I have about 10 minutes, and I'd certainly want to make sure that we get everything that you need answered.
Thanks, Jeff. Look here, while we're waiting for questions, as a reminder, you can either raise your hand and we'll unmute your line, or just submit them through the GoToWebinar question box, and I can read them off to Jeff. On the screen here, you'll see a couple of additional items we wanted to mention for our upcoming events found at socius1.com/events. Our next GP monthly user webinar will be on October 22nd, covering choosing the right GP reporting tool. Also mention our Solution Spotlight series focusing on CRM are coming up next week, and the GP User Group Summit User Conference is next month in Reno. And this has Jeff's contact information in case you do want to reach out to him for specific questions about your organization. It's his direct phone line as well as email.